Okay. So today, we'll start off talking about generalized additive models. So this is building off of the splines that we ended up talking about last time. But the difference here, so the generalized additive models will actually help to maintain some interpretability by additivity of terms. So this uses a spline for each individual variable. And then adds them together. So the way this works is if we have our sort of typical linear regression that looks something like this. Then you end up transforming the regression to something like this. Where this is the smoothing function that does the transformation of our variable. Okay, so I think the easiest way to help interpret this is if we go ahead and show an example of this. So I'm gonna go ahead and move on over to our studio. And let's take a look at an example of applying a GAN. So we're going to use our ISLR library, and then the hitters data set. And we'll also need a library called MGCV, which you'll have to install. This is the package that lets us use general additive models. So that's what GAM stands for, General Additive Model. And the way this works is we can specify it as kind of a regular regression. So I'm going to add in a couple of different variables. Actually, what we'll do first, let me copy and paste this really quick. Let's take a look at so we can compare. Oops, I have to run everything. C runs should be capital here. Okay, so if I run this and I look at the summary, okay, we can see the size of our coefficients here and which things are significance. And I can do the same thing for my gamut. And what you'll find is that you have identical results here. So we can see our estimates are all exactly the same as in the linear regression. And that's because in the general additive model, it's essentially just running a linear regression. It hasn't actually done the spline transformation yet. And so the way that you do that is we add this S function around any of the variables that you want to be able to look that you want to do a spline transformation on. So I'm going to do that for everything except for division, which is a discrete variable. And now if I run the summary, yeah, we actually see something a little bit different here. So for the parametric coefficients, we actually see estimates here, and these are interpreted in the same way that you do with the linear. But then for these are not sort of coefficients. So remember, we had that squiggly line from the last lecture, and that's not something that you can just, there isn't like a simple slope or anything like that that you can interpret, right? So what do these mean? Let's actually show a better way of looking at this. We can actually plot this. Okay, so what are we looking at here? These are the plots of my explanatory variable versus my response variable. Now, if this were from a linear regression, each of these would be just straight lines, right? However, these are now undergoing our spline transformation so that they can sort of better fit the data. In some cases, you could maybe argue that like a linear transformation, or that a spline transformation isn't too different from a linear, in which case I could go back in and change that. So for example, if I look at this line here for putouts, and maybe even for this one, the CRBI, I might argue, okay, these are relatively linear. So you can go back in here and say, let me just leave them as linear terms, right? And you'd be able to run the model again. But for everything else, we can see that there's oftentimes some kind of like inflection point. Like here, we can see there's like a kink in the walks explanatory variable. It gets to some point and then the slope changes. We can see in a lot of cases it kind of goes up and down a little bit right here. This one seems to taper off and start to decrease. So anytime you are seeing something that's not a straight line, that is indicative of a nonlinear relationship between your x's and your y's. And even if you end up just doing like linear models, or you just want to kind of take the average effect or something like that, it's usually a good idea to try and run this type of model just to be able to determine whether or not the assumption that there's a linear relationship between your explanatory variable and your response variable is true. Because we can definitely see, right, that there are some examples of these where I probably would think it's a bit of a stretch to have it as a linear relationship. Some other things to note here. So the dotted lines are in reference to the standard errors, and oftentimes they're going to get a lot bigger sort of at the boundaries. And one thing to note, at the bottom of the x-axis, you can see that there are these little tick marks here, and these tick marks refer to the actual data points. Okay, and so you can see, for example, C runs. There are a lot more sort of data points here, and then there's just one data point out at 1500 and one data point at sort of past 2000. So you might want to say, okay, like I don't know too much about what's going on over here, but like maybe 1000 and below, I'm pretty confident that the shape kind of looks like this, right? Same for RBI, you know, there's not that many points above 1000 or actually even above 500. So you'd say, okay, I'm pretty confident that the line kind of looks like this in this area, but less confident about this. And with hits, for example, this is a lot more uniform. So you get things in between, say, like 50 and like 175 are pretty, there's a pretty good amount of data there. So that can help you kind of gauge what this, gauge where you're sort of most confident about what the line looks like. Okay, any questions about this?
Hey, Alan, so is this a residual graph or what? I'm not sure. Like, we can see that it's the fit line, but which kind of fit line we're talking about? Or this is the slope line? I'm not sure.
Yeah, this is the plot of your x against your y, basically. So this would be this would be a plot of the fit of your x against your y.
Oh, I see.
So if you remember, let's see. We've done this kind of graph many times, right? That's what these graphs are, but in this case, it's not linear because we added in the spline transformation. And so if this were a linear plot, you would observe that all of these lines would be straight, but they're not. And that's because once we add the spline functionality, it's essentially being revealed that there are sort of nonlinear relationships between the data, between your explanatory variables and your response variables. Okay, any other questions or issues? Why is the salary negative? That's a good question. Oops. Let me see. Why is the salary negative? So we don't have any negative values in the salary. But I'm guessing things are yeah. Okay. So one of the things to remember is that these terms are additive. So if you guys remember in the wages example that we had done earlier in class, sometimes you get these things that are like so it was like years of education and wages. And sometimes we were getting something like this with a negative intercept on the wage, even though wages have to be like physically, right? They're positive. So that can happen. But there are two reasons why this actually still kind of makes sense. One is that like all of your data are in portions of the plot where you never sort of are extrapolating out to these negative wages. And the other reason is that if you have multiple variables, that's how you can get from negative to positive, right? So for example, let's just say that I am looking at a point over here. And so corresponding to maybe a negative point here, but maybe that corresponds to some point over here, some point over here, where you end up adding, right? Because these are all additive terms. You add to your outcome and eventually your salary becomes positive. So that's possible as well, but it doesn't necessarily totally preclude the possibility that you could end up with a negative salary. That would be some kind of, model, it would be some kind of model error that it's estimating a negative salary. That can happen. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. So let me jump back over to whiteboard. And now we'll talk about a sort of totally different way of doing a non-parametric approach. In the spline approach, we built up this kind of functionality, right? We did this. We did the polynomial regression, and then the piecewise linear regression. We then combine this into the cubic splines, then natural splines, and sort of built up this approach of doing what would be this sort of semi-parametric or non-parametric approach to fitting our data. But it's not the only way that you can do this type of analysis. So we're going to look at an alternative type of regression that can do similar types of things, and we'll talk about the sort of strengths and weaknesses of doing these two different approaches. So what I'll be talking about now is known as a kernel regression. This is a very sort of different class of approach that you can take to doing these sort of highly nonlinear, non-parametric fits. So in this case, our y hat of x is going to be the sum of k okay. So this is the mathematical formula for estimating this kernel regression. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in a moment, but let's try and think about how this kind of works conceptually. So here's the sort of basic concept. Let's say I have my x and my y, and I have something that looks like this. And let's say I have a point right here. Let's say at this x, what is y? Sorry, I shouldn't have drawn the point there first. So the main thing is we're looking at a particular x. So this is kind of similar to our k nearest neighbors idea. So similar to k and n. This y point ended up getting chosen because it's looking at sort of the neighbors. Okay, and so these guys have some effect, and then these guys not much effect. So it'll end up choosing kind of a point near to where these x's are. You can imagine that, let's take the exact same set of points. It kind of looks like a W here. You can imagine that if I expand the sort of territory that I'm looking at, right? So if in the initial one, I was kind of just looking in this sort of area, then I might choose a point there. But if I choose to expand my horizons and look at a sort of larger area, then my estimate might be a little bit higher here, right? Because it's almost like it's averaging amongst all of the points, all 5 of the points, instead of just the 2 closest ones. So this would be weighting farther points equally. Okay, so let me go back to this equation here. So H is the bandwidth. The larger H is, the more we consider farther points. The smaller H is, the more we consider local points. And the whole idea is that H normalizes xi minus x when big, and H magnifies xi minus x when small. Okay, so let me give a couple examples of k of x, which is our kernel transformation. Okay, so there's something known as the box kernel. So there's actually more kernels that I'm going to list here, but these are kind of by far the most commonly used. So this is k of x is equal to 1/2 if absolute value of x is less than or equal to 1, 0 otherwise. There is the Gaussian kernel. So this is k of x is equal to 1/√2 pi exp negative x squared over 2. And then there is what is known as the, I don't even know how to pronounce it. Nikov kernel. K of x is equal to 3/4 times 1 minus x squared if x is less than or equal to 1 and 0 otherwise. Okay. This is just kind of to give you a sense of what the kernels are doing, to make sure they're kind of not really a black box. You can go in and kind of figure this out, and you can also play around with the different kernel transformations to see how they affect your fit. But in practice, choice of H is more important. And again, this H is this window, right? H is whether we do this or whether we do this. So how do we determine the correct value for H? What do you guys think?
I mean, again, cross validation, right?
Yes, cross-validation, exactly. Same answer as always. So basically, right here, I can choose some H value and fit some lines, right? That might look something like this. And you could even get really extreme. Maybe you'll have something like this. And the way that I can determine whether the best line is green, blue, or yellow, based off of the H bandwidth that I've chosen, is the one that gives me the best out of sample predictions. Same story that we've had for a lot of these different models. Okay. So splines versus kernels. Faster to compute. Simplicity. And you have some clarity in controlling curve directly. Kernels are easier to program, easier to analyze mathematically if you need to do that. Easier to extend to multiple variables and combinations of discrete or continuous variables is easier. So there So there are some strengths and weaknesses to running both of these models. Okay. Let's look at implementing.
Alan?
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
Sure.
when do we how do we identify when to use like splines or kernel?
Yeah, it's up to you. There are some times where it's easier to do kernels versus splines. Oftentimes it's a good. Oftentimes, at least when I'm looking at this, I end up running both and kind of seeing which one does a better job. And then for multivariate problems, usually you'll move towards doing like a GAM for the splines. Otherwise, the sort of interaction of splines across multiple explanatory variables gets really tricky, or you could do it in a kernel, which is a lot easier to implement.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions? Okay, I'm going to jump on over to our studio. And what we'll do now is to just implement the model or the sort of curvy data that we had last time that we were using with our splines. Okay, so we'll need a new library called NP. that I believe stands for non-parametric. And we're going to make our same plot as last time. So if you don't recall, it should look something like this. Yeah, so this is our plot that we were trying to fit our splines to last time. We can fit our linear model really quick just to see what this looks like. And we have a red line. That is our linear fit going through our data like so. Okay, we need to compare the data a little bit by ordering it. And that's more for plotting the lines later. We'll see. So then let's run our kernel model. So I'm not going to specify the kernel. I believe the default is the box. It's either the box kernel or the Gaussian kernel. I don't remember what's the default one that it uses. But let's see what happens here. So here, when I run npreg instead of lm, this is the way that you run a kernel regression. It tells, we specified the bandwidth. This is our h as 0.05. And it tells us our residual standard error and our r squared. So let's take a look at what this looks like. So this plot here is in red, the actual fit. Okay, we can see that I put in the curve for the true equation. And then our kernel regression is going to be this. X, I'm going to x dot ord, which is going to order my x's and then plot it against the kernel. To, or sorry, 1 x dot ord. Let me actually get rid of the x dot ord for now, just to show you guys why I'm doing this. This would be my plot of my x's against my y's here. But because it's not in any particular order, if I plot this, it's going to go from, you know, point to point based off of whatever is in whatever random order that I was in before, which is why I have this x dot ord thing. So this just puts everything sequentially from smallest to largest x's. So we'll plot this again. Oops, I didn't do that. Okay. So here we can see the blue line, which is the estimated value from our kernel regression. And that is, yeah, quite close, right, to our red line, which is the true value. So you can see in a pretty simple way, we're able to get very close to the outcome that we want. And what I'll say about this is that I've chosen, okay, let's say I got lucky. In this case, where I happen to have stumbled across a decent value of the bandwidth, which is getting me close to the true value. We can take a look at sort of what happens as you make the bandwidth smaller or larger, right? And so in this case, let's look at shrinking the bandwidth, okay, and see what happens. So as I kind of talked about in the notes earlier, typically the smaller you are, the more it starts to consider sort of local points. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to copy this, paste it, and I'm going to do kernel model 2, and I'm going to shrink the bandwidth to 0.01 from 0.05. The summary, and then all I do is change this to 2, and I'll run this. And what you can start to see happening is that it's starting to get a little spiky, right? And this is an artifact of it weighting the points close by a little bit more. And so it starts to jump up and down. So this is our classic example of something that we might imagine starting to look slightly more overfit. Okay. And if I go ahead and do this again, let's actually decrease the size of the bandwidth even more. Imagine here, we're going to get really quite spiky. Yeah. And so at a certain point, right, it's going to jump basically to every sort of point. And this might be a sort of more obvious example of it sort of being overfit. We can also go in the other direction, right? Let's see what happens if I increase the size of the bandwidth. So let's go bandwidth of 0.1. What you can see happening here is that now the line is, it's being influenced more by points farther away. So even though there are high points over here that it would like to get to, it's looking out a little bit farther. For if I'm, say, looking at a point here, it's not only looking at this point, it's also looking at all of these points here. So it's having a harder time jumping up to that sort of cluster of points. Everything starts to get more and more muted in terms of its ability to like go up and down along the y-axis. And this just becomes more and more pronounced the more we increase the size of the bandwidth. So let's go 10 times bigger, kernel model 5. You can see here, it captures some kind of trend here, but most of its ability to follow along the points closely is washed out because it's considering such a large bandwidth area. And last one, kernel model 6, bandwidth even larger. Okay, I have essentially a flat line here. And this line is simply going to be the mean value. Once your bandwidth is large enough, it's just going to be the mean value of all of my data points of my y along all of my x's. This really is kind of analogous to the k nearest neighbors, right? Where in the classification, it considers the one with the most points. Here, it's just considering the average of all of my data points. You can apply a cross validation. And actually, why don't I? So I actually just slightly changed my cross validation function. Modified the one that we've kind of been working with to do this. There are obviously examples of how to do this. So, okay, this will be posted. You don't need to follow along for this part. It's a lot. But hopefully you guys are familiar with this chunk of code here, which is that cross-validation function that we've been using. And you can use this function to do a cross-validation on different values of h or your bandwidth and figure out which one's the best. So I can run this. Look at some results. And then I can go through all of these to figure out sort of what's the lowest mean squared error based off of my bandwidth choices. And it turns out it ends up being something like this. So let's see what happens with a bandwidth of 0.025. This is probably the sort of closest match and the best sort of out of sample predictor for our true function in red. Okay. Any questions about kernel regressions? Okay. Let's jump on back to a whiteboard. Okay, so we are going to jump to a very sort of different topic now. We are going to be talking about something known as unsupervised learning. This will be related to some of the sort of techniques that we've kind of talked about, but the application of this is very different. Unlike in a regression, where you are looking at sets of explanatory variables and response variables, that is known as supervised learning, because essentially what you're trying to do is understand the relationship between your explanatory and your response variables. But you could be just doing data exploration or trying to do other sorts of data analysis that don't involve a response variable. And so that's what unsupervised learning is. So this examines undetected patterns in data. And it focuses on settings with only explanatory variables. No response variables. And therefore, not interested in prediction. It wants to identify subgroups among variables. And importantly, unable to conduct any sort of validation. So now if I ask you a question about unsupervised learning, the answer is not cross-validation, because you can't do cross-validation for unsupervised learning tests. There are two primary approaches. One is principal components analysis. We actually talked about this already. This is one way you can sort of vectorize the contributions of the data against some kind of variable. For PCA, this would be the steps of your PCR, the principal components regression that we talked about, without actually doing the regression. It's just looking at the perpendicular components of each of your explanatory variables. So you're not doing anything with the response variable. And this can be useful for data visualization or pre-processing of data. We're not going to talk about PCA today. We're going to focus on the second approach, which is known as clustering. And so some of you guys may have done something with this before, but we'll talk about this a little bit more formally. Okay, so we're going to start with something known as k-means clustering. It's one of the most common examples of clustering. This is a simple approach to partition data set into k data sets, or k distinct non-overlapping clusters. And K must be pre-specified. So you get to choose if I want to group all my data into 2 clusters, 3 clusters, 4 clusters, however many. And again, there's no like validation here, so you don't necessarily have the ability to determine a correct number of clusters for your data. So here's the equation. This is going to be one of those equations that are like purely for reference. Don't worry too much about what this means. This is the number of observations in K at the cluster. We'll talk about how to interpret this in a second. So I prime belong as an element of CK. So that's the equation, which is a pretty complex representation of what is actually, I think, a relatively straightforward way of looking at this. So let me describe how this works. We have some algorithm. So 1, randomly assign 1 minus K to each observation. To iterate until no more changes. So A, for each K cluster, compute centroid. B, assign each observation to cluster with closest centroid. So this is by Euclidean distance. And note scaling. Oops. Normalization is important. All right, so what does this look like? X1, X2. Okay. I have a bunch of points. I have a bunch of points here, and they've just been totally randomly assigned into blue or red. Imagine they were black at first, and then you just randomly assign them into these groups. I will now take the centroid of each of these guys. So for red, my centroid will be maybe approximately here. And then for blue, my centroid will be approximately here. Okay. I'm going to now reassign each of these points into a new group based off of which cluster that it's now closest to. This guy is closest to here, it's blue. This guy's closest to here, it's blue. This guy is closest to here, it's blue. This guy is closest to here, it gets reassigned as blue. And then these guys are closest to this point. So now it'll look something like this. These are my new assignments. Now it's no longer random, it's based off of this thing that I just did. We can recalculate the centroid. For red, it'll probably be something like this. For blue, it'll probably be something like this. And what we can see is that already in my second iteration, there are no reassignments happening, right? So everything that's red stays red. Everything that's blue stays blue. And so now I'm done. My algorithm finishes because there's no longer any change, because if I kept repeating this, it would do the same thing over and over. And that is the way that the clustering assignments are determined based off of this specific algorithm. Any questions about this? Okay. Let me jump on over to our studio. And let's implement an example of this in R. Use a data set called auto. Data table real quick. I'm going to essentially cluster these sets of points, horsepower versus MPG. the first thing I need to do is to scale them. One of the things you'll notice is that horsepower is an order of magnitude larger than my MPG. And so sorry. We might have to end a little earlier. I'm like losing my voice. Let me get through the k-means and then we'll have to stop for today. Let's see. We have to scale because the MPG is about 10x smaller than my horsepower. So when you do the Euclidean distance, the horsepower variable is going to like dominate the MPG variable, and you want, usually in k-means clustering, you want to try and make sure that they're each of the variables have kind of like an equal weighting. I mean, you don't always have to do it like that, but generally, unless you have a reason to, you'll want to scale your variables. So I'm going to have this auto scaled. And we're just looking at two variables here. So I'm just going to include those guys, MPG and horsepower. Create an object called k-means.to. All I have to do is feed in the data and specify the number of clusters at the end here. So let's see what this looks like. So this tells you the means of the cluster. So this will give you the location. So there's one at, this is the scaled version, right? So these aren't really going to make total sense in terms of on this plot, but you have one at, you know, if your MPG is on your X and your horsepower is on your Y, it'll be at 0.5 and negative 0.5, and then at negative 1 and 1. And then these are the assignment groups. So there's two clusters. The first entry will belong to cluster 2, second entry will belong to cluster 2, and so on and so forth. I can run this for more clusters as well. What I'm going to do is, in my original data set, I'm going to add in a column k.clusters.2, k.clusters.3, k.clusters.4, which is the assignments. So let me run this and look at auto. I now have extra columns that are telling me new assignments of each of these variables. Plot it. This is having two clusters. It breaks out the points like this. Three clusters. You can change this to 3. Looks like this. 4 clusters. 5 clusters. Unlike a lot of these parameters, like bandwidth or lambda, like the penalty parameters in some of the spline stuff or Ridge and Lasso, where we used cross-validation in order to determine what value to set them at. Here, the value of k isn't something that you can validate. So oftentimes, you know, people will ask me like, okay, how do I know how many clusters that I want in the data? And I think that that is much more sort of context specific to the type of problem that you're trying to do. Like, does it make sense that you have like few clusters or lots of clusters? Like, what are you going to try and do with it afterwards? So there isn't really sort of a clear answer. It's highly dependent on what you're trying to do with the data. What I'll say is that there is one thing that people will do to try and choose clusters. So if you look at this value, oh, is it the total? I forget. I think it's the total. Okay. So one thing that some people will do is they'll look at the total SS values as you go from fewer to more sort of clusters. And so we can look at what that looks like. So if I do 2, oh, no, it is between, sorry, hang on. Why is this not in my notes? Okay. So if you look at the between SS values, there's one thing that some people will do where you can plot number of clusters, number of k versus your between SS. And it might look something like this. Usually the shape looks something like this. And there's like this rough rule of thumb that if you choose what's called, I think it's called the elbow rule, where you choose the kink in the curve, like that's for some reason a choice of cluster that is less arbitrary because of you know, there's this like standardized metric for like identifying this. So this is either it's referred to as the elbow rule or the kink rule. You can use this technique to help you determine the number of clusters if you really have nothing else to if you have nothing else to work with. Okay, so I'm gonna end a little bit early today. So we'll end on this clustering technique, and we'll talk about hierarchical clustering at the start of next class. Any questions about k-means clustering? Oh, I see someone raising a hand. Afshan?
Yeah, so you said like there is no predictive variable and we are trying to do everything with the explanatory variables, right? Then how we can see this graph, like which kind of, insights we are getting from this graph that you.
Yeah, so this has no response variables. These are just two X variables graphed against each other.
Mhm.
The whole idea here is like, you got this big data set and you want to like group things together. You don't want to, you're not doing any like predictions on values or anything like that. You're just trying to like subset your data. And the unsupervised learning is the general sort of the field that this refers to. And then k-means clustering is a specific technique of unsupervised learning where I can separate my data into like different groups.
I see, and the means that we get when we run any k-means algorithm. So these are the centroids, right?
Yes, that's right.
Mhm. So the number of k and the number of means or centroids will be equal. So the value of k that we will specify.
Yeah. So we can see here there are 5 means for your clusters.
Mhm.
And so this is the k-means with 5 clusters. So there's always one centroid location for each cluster. That's right.
Okay, so we are seeing like the other regression models, we don't have any cross-validation technique, right? But when you were explaining that k-means, you were saying like we are iterating it, like the position of the centroid until it will remain same.
Yes.
How
Yeah.
this algorithm is doing that, because we are specifying the k, right? So it should be 5k, which means 5 centroid. Then how we get to know that this is the point where it will, have the same value. The centroid will remain same.
That's the thing that I was showing in the notes earlier. So imagine that all of these points are black.
Mm-hmm.
And then I randomly assign them as like red and blue. Let me do it here. Let me do it with 2 instead of 5. So here, imagine all of these points are black. And then I randomly assign red and green.
2k, the value of k should be 2, right?
Yeah. So let's say we're starting with k equals 2. And then I just randomly assign certain points are red and then certain points are green. This is the algorithm that I was showing.
Yeah.
So you take the centroid, and let's say because there are some green points down here and there's a bunch of green points up there, let's say the centroid is like right here.
Mm-hmm.
And then let's say the centroid of the red points are over here. So now these points are going to get reassigned to being green, right? Because it's closest to the green.
Yep.
And then these points are going to get reassigned as being red because it's closest to the red.
Yeah.
So you can imagine that like everything down here will be red.
Mm-hmm.
And then everything over here will be green.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
And then it actually might even just, right along this line, it's closer to red. So, so these points are going to be green, and then these points are going to be red, right? because it's picking which centroid it's closest to.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. I just want to make sure, like when you assign the k to 5, right? So it will do this 5 times, right?
It will make 5. Yeah, it will make 5 points. So it'll make a, there will be some kind of like blue centroid, and there's probably going to be some kind of like yellow centroid and another, black centroid, whatever.
Oh, I see. So when you assign 5, it will start with 5 centroids, right?
Yes, randomly. Those
Okay,
centroids
and
could be
then it
anywhere.
will run again and again, and it will complete that iterative process by itself.
Yes,
Okay.
exactly. And then it will converge so that all the points around it are like the same color.
Got it now. Thank you so
Yeah.
much.
Yeah. Good. Okay. Thanks everyone. We'll have to do, I think for UC Davis, the rule is 10 days. So at least Thursday and next Tuesday, we'll still have to do this online version. So sorry about the inconvenience. And then we'll see from there. Thanks everyone. Bye.